Welcome, everybody. Informed Schools. We have a really incredible discussion planned for you tonight. I have three amazing panelists who are going to introduce themselves to you in just a minute. But before we get started, let me just thank the National Life Group, LifeChanger of the Year, and the National Coalition for Safe Schools for putting this on, for bringing us together. My name is Mike Soskel. I am a Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year 2017. A Global Teacher Prize finalist, and I am a elementary science teacher in Northeastern Pennsylvania. Trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed schools are something that I'm very passionate about, so it is an absolute pleasure to be able to moderate this panel. But let me turn it over to our other three panelists. Then I'm going to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to give you a couple of guidelines, and we'll roll right into the discussion. So Ben, do you want to start off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Fernandez, and I'm a school psychologist. I've been practicing for about 24 years, and I'm a lead school psychologist for a school system in Northern Virginia, and I'm also a high school psychologist. I also serve on the National Association of School Psychologists School Safety and Crisis Response Committee that provides a number of different services and research, advocacy, and training around school safety and crisis response.
Thanks, Ben. Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie Lopez, and I'm a master teacher of about 30 years. And I have been training educators in developing trauma-informed schools for the last 7 years. And I'm presently working on a TED Talk on this topic. I won the Golden Apple for excellence in teaching. And I've been selected as one of the top 50 teachers in the world by Varkey International. And I have been training teachers and all over the world. Actually, I'm an avid traveler, and wherever I travel, I train teachers. So it's very much of a pleasure to be here tonight so we can help the children.
Great. And Arlinda.
My name is Arlinda Davis. I am a first grade teacher, just retired from Birmingham City Schools, Avondale Elementary. I taught almost 26 years there. I am the LifeChanger Year nominee for 2019-2020. I am the Sanford Harmony Inspired State winner for Alabama for 2020. And I just have really been on a path with the We Foundation to talk about trauma in the trauma-informed classroom. So I'm very happy to be here for that today.
Well, thank you all. And I know we were having a discussion before the broadcast. Difficult it is to introduce yourself, how it can sometimes come across as being as bragging, but all three of you are absolutely incredible educators, and we are so blessed to have you on this panel. LifeChanger of the Year and NCSS did a fantastic job of choosing you. I can't wait to dive into this discussion. And Ben, I'm going to direct this first question at you, and then we can kind of go from there, and anyone else that wants to can dive in. Before we talk about trauma-informed schools and trauma-informed practices, I think we need to come up with some kind of definition for trauma. So when we're talking about trauma, what is that, and how does it differ from social emotional learning or mental health or some of the other terms that we hear in education right now?
Sure. I think to understand what trauma is, we need to kind of take a step before trauma and understand that what adverse childhood experiences are. And the adverse, or ACEs, you'll hear us throughout our conversation today talk about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and that is that objective experience or incident that can impact a student. It can be acute, it can be chronic, and that is kind of the kind of starting event, for lack of a better word. Now, trauma comes in is that is the unique experience of the individual to the adverse childhood experience. So that unique experience, it could be emotional, could be behavioral, could be a number of different things, and that is that individual, that student's personal experience as it relates to the ACE. And there are a number of different adverse experiences out there that impact students every day. I'm just going to name a few. One being, exposure to death by suicide, parent mental illness, abuse, neglect, homelessness, And I think we'll probably have some conversation over the next few minutes about how this current pandemic is causing some degree of impact on not only our students but our teachers as well. So that's kind of what we're starting with. And I think when we talk about SEL, mental health, SEL in particular, I think in trauma informed schools and classrooms are the ways that we can navigate the challenges and help these children navigate the challenges they're experiencing because of the trauma they've experienced through the ACEs. And I'll let the rest of the panel, if they have anything more to chime in to add to that.
Supporting SEL for students is a trauma sensitive practice in itself. And the two of them really do go together, but I think the overarching concept is trauma informed or trauma sensitive schools. And everything else falls into it in terms of how to handle the children who are dealing with whatever that trauma brings up in them.
Yeah, so that's a good place to transition to. And Arlinda, I'm going to direct this at you first, and then everyone else can jump in. So I think Ben and Jackie did a great job of defining kind of what those adverse childhood experiences are, how they lead to trauma. But how does trauma manifest itself in our schools?
When you look at children coming in and you see them when they used to be maybe happy-go-lucky, or maybe they the next day or a few days later, you see them being really reserved to themselves, or they may act out. They may have an adverse reaction where they're trying to basically scream for help. If they're having temper tantrums or being defiant, that's a way for it to manifest. When you see a child who basically is not acting like they normally would, that's a significant sign that something's going on. If you have a child who's very shy and they don't talk, then a lot of times you may need to find out if they're just shy or if it's something else that's going on that's causing them to shut down. And so you may see a child who may come in sleepy every day, and that child may not be getting sleep at night due to something going on, whether it's arguing, whether it's they may live in an area where there's a lot of violence, where you hear gunshots. So if they come in, they're tired every day. That's a key thing for you to look for, to say not just, oh, this child's sleeping in my class, but what's going on? Why are you so sleepy? Or why are you so hungry? So there are a lot of things in behavior changes that you should look for.
Jackie, this is something that you're really passionate about too. I know that that this is really where your work in trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed schools is. So why don't you talk a little bit about this too? How does trauma manifest itself?
Well, students who've experienced and lived through trauma are often going to have a difficult time commencing tasks, taking risks, completing tasks, interacting socially appropriately with others, transitioning appropriately, regulating themselves, and even being motivated enough to try. But you really have to look past all that. And they're also capable of all kinds of capricious, unexpected, dysregulated behaviors that can really flip your classroom upside down sometimes. But you have to look past that and ask why. And once you find out, you're not going to be angry. It's going to break your heart.
And if I may add to that, Michael, I think, I agree with everything Arlinda and Jackie are saying. And I think what makes understanding what the manifestation of trauma is, as teachers, it's easy. As educators, it's easy to see that if someone has a broken arm, they have a sling. They know we have to make adaptations, we know we have to adjust. But for trauma, we may not necessarily see it outwardly. I mean, initially, we may see those behavioral outbursts and things like that. And I think for me, it really boils down to how available is the student while they're in school. They may be sitting at a desk, but are they available for the instruction? Are they available for the social interaction? Or are they so focused on, where's the next threat coming from? So I really think it can look, I agree with everybody, it can look many, many different ways, and it can look differently across the age range from preschool all the way to high school.
So I definitely want to dive into what we can do as educators. But before I get there, I want to go back to something that Arlinda said, because it's a question that I wrote down next to me that I'm kind of chewing on in my own brain here as we're talking. So Arlinda mentioned that sometimes we see a change in students when they've gone through that ACE, that adverse childhood experience. They come to school and there's a difference. They're quieter than they used to be. They're more tired. But what about children who are constantly experiencing those home situations where they are always where there are always those traumatic experiences that are happening, and it almost becomes normal for them? In those cases, we may not see a change, or on the flip side, we're starting a school year. We may be getting new sets of students that we don't know what their baseline is. We don't know what their norm is. What advice would you give to teachers in those kinds of situations?
Well, I think the whole thing about calling a child unmotivated is it's a wrong term, because every child can be motivated if you know how. And it all bases down on building a trusting relationship with the child. They have to know from day one that you care enough to build that relationship with them and be there with them even when the chips are down. And that unmotivated, that whole notion of that just makes me crazy when parents say or lazy. That's another one. These kids are not unmotivated or lazy. They're suffering from the pain and fear and indifference that come as a result of trauma. And you have to get to know them, first of all, to build their trust, so then they can talk to you when they need to, because they all need to go to somebody sometimes. And they have to have that one person, that one adult.
We find ourselves sometimes asking, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And maybe taking a step back and saying, wait a second, I need to check myself as the adult here and say, what happened to you that is causing you to do that? There's always a function behind the behavior, and trying to understand that. And like Jackie said, once we understand that, then it could be a heartbreaker. But that's also the starting point to know how we can help that student work through the school day.
When I think about the pandemic, and I'm a very visual person because I'm first grade, but when I thought about the pandemic and I thought about people who were going around talking about wearing masks and how they felt that was, sometimes it's traumatic because of the things that happen, I thought about children and how they come to us and how they wear a mask for their trauma. So I made a little diagram, and if you see, when a child wears a mask, it covers up everything but their eyes. And a lot of times as teachers, we have to look in their eyes sometimes to see what's going on. Look beyond the mask, look to see what's going on. We have to see, we know we wear a mask for protection. They wear a mask to protect what's going on, because sometimes they don't know how to say it, or they don't know what to do to let someone know that something's going on. And so I was saying, when we unmask what's going on, you'll see the trauma behind the mask. And it might be fatigue, it might be something going on at school, even bullying, where they're dealing with someone at school who's doing something to them. It may be their home situation. And so when we unmask the trauma, we unpack, we ask the why, then that's when we get to what's going on, the real child. And so as teachers, that's what our goal is with trauma, is to get to that real child, what's going on, ask the why, find out. We talk about the mask fogs up our glasses, which we need glasses to see clearly. Well, sometimes that trauma is fogging up. That mask they have on is fogging up our vision to see what's going on. So as teachers, we are going to have to ask the why, ask the what, ask, what's going on, or just pull them aside. Also, we always talk about the 6 feet, staying 6 feet apart for safety, but sometimes we have to give children a safe place, a 6 feet distance where they can go and deal with it, to give them, let them know we trust them, we have a safe place for them, they can trust us to build that relationship, like Jackie was saying. And so I just think about, if we can get beyond what's going on with that child, and if it's making our class disruptive, and find out the why, then that'll be a great start.
Yeah, so Arlinda gets bonus points for bringing visual aids. So 50 bonus points to Arlinda. But I think, Arlinda, you put us on a track that we definitely need to dive into, and that is the pandemic, right? Because this has caused trauma in not just students, but also for teachers. And we have this enormous challenge in the upcoming school year. Some of us are teaching virtually. Some of us are teaching in person with kids in masks. Some of us are doing both at the same time. And in all of those situations, relationship building and maintaining relationships is more important than ever. So what advice would you give to teachers in time with these challenges that they have going forward? Anyone that wants to chime in?
Well, I would suggest that when teachers have a block of time where they have all their students, for that first morning meeting or whatever they call it, that they break that block down into small concern circle meetings, and where they would have maybe 4 of those with maybe 6 children each for 15 minutes. And that would take up their hour, and that way she could introduce questions which would help them build connections with each other and build a safety net with each other.
I agree that it really just starts with the relationship and starting as soon as possible. Not only building the relationship with your students, which is vitally important, but it's also building the relationship with your peers and your colleagues. Because as you said, Michael, everyone to some degree has been impacted by COVID and the shutdown. And so how are you going to build those relationships with your peers? And then reaching out to the families as well. How are we going to build those relationships with the families? And when I say get to build those relationships with families, get to know them and like what are their needs, what are their struggles at that point? Because if you get a sense of that, you're going to get a sense of what their child is going to be struggling with, and how you might be able to help not only their child but their family as well. I know a lot of schools are providing a number of different types of supports and resources for families, whether it's food or other supports. So I think the foundation of anything we do because of COVID is that relationship building in any form.
And it's also great to try and get those parents who aren't necessarily the PTA parents because they work 3 jobs or whatever, to get them to showcase their strength. And whether it be talking about their culture or talking about their job or their religion, they could easily come into the class or do it, remotely. I had a woman, a Hispanic woman, come into my class and teach all about Hispanic culture. And she brought food and she shared it with everyone in all their classes. And I've had another woman come in, and I did a unit on world religions, and another woman came in and taught about her Muslim culture. Then there was a Jewish woman who came in, and we had a Hindi speaker. But I had another mother come in and talk about how to use math at her job at the gas station. So every parent is valuable, and once you start to connect with the parents, the kids benefit.
So I'm gonna ask a difficult question, because I think that's the purpose here, right? We have to get into some difficult conversations, and I want to build off what Jackie was saying and really dive into that community-school relationship, parent-school relationship. And the fact of the matter is, we know that sometimes schools cause trauma. Even when we have the best of intentions, sometimes we make mistakes. Our school system sometimes forces us to do things that are not necessarily in the best interest of all students. And we know that trauma is inflicted. And we know that sometimes parents are afraid to come into the school because they have experienced that trauma in their own schooling, and now their kids are going through the school system, and sometimes that's a problem. So the fact of the matter is, sometimes teachers don't necessarily reflect the communities that they're teaching. And there is misunderstandings there between parents and teachers. How do we overcome these systemic barriers, which are inflicting trauma on students or have inflicted trauma on parents? How do we bridge that gap and start fixing those broken relationships?
Well, I think it's really allowing for space to have those conversations. I think I think then sometimes that's the initial step. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it simply because it's difficult and uncomfortable. But allowing, and dedicating space to have those conversations, I think it would be a fantastic starting point. You can do circles around these conversations with students. You can start these conversations with parents as well. And I think that for me, I think would be an excellent starting point to address some of those concerns.
I had a student in the 4th grade who had some kind of race-related confrontation on the playground. And it turned out that some of her little Caucasian friends said something about her being Black. And this just traumatized her from the minute she heard it. And she came in and she was hysterical and she was sobbing and she's calling everyone racist. And the teacher just went like this to me. She didn't have any idea what to do because I guess she'd never worked with a multicultural group. So I talked to this girl. I sat down and talked with her, and she really needed to be heard, have those feelings validated. And in that conversation, she finally took her hood off and finally put her coat on the back of her chair. And she revealed to me that she had come in and found her younger brother who had hung himself. And this was her trauma and her parents did not believe in getting any kind of therapy for anyone in the family because we're dealing with it, a family. So when that came to, all of this came out like a giant burst, and that one thing triggered it. And I had the other children who, mentioned her color. I had them come over and I explained to them how you can't do that, and then I told the girl to explain how it made her feel. And they're like, oh. And so they all apologized to her. And that's what she needed to hear. That I said, they're not being mean. They're ignorant. They just don't know, what hurts people's feelings if they haven't been around certain kinds of, groups of people very much. And so this whole thing came out, and this girl, but I just was shocked so much at how the teacher had no idea how to deal with that child. And she came out of it eventually. It took me like 45 minutes in there, and we got through it. But that's the kind of attention and time you need to give students. As soon as they reveal that they're frustrated, you need to find out why. And it turned out that she had a behavior disorder tagged on her. And I truly believe in the theory that there is no such thing as a behavior disorder. It's the society's, naming of what is a result of trauma.
I agree with Jackie even about establishing relationships, establishing that communication with not only children, but with their parents. When you have that type of relationship, you never know some of the trauma that children are experiencing. It may be a result of something going on at home that the parent doesn't know how to resolve. And that's when you step in and you get your counselors involved to see what type of help you can give to help that parent help that child.
So I think, Jackie, during your story, one thing that struck me was the teacher that didn't know what to do, right? Mm-hmm. That put her hands up. And I think, from my own experience in schools over the past 23 years, I think, sometimes that is a result of worrying that you're going to get involved in something political that you shouldn't, right? Although we know that we have to get involved in these conversations because our students' health depends on it. But part of it is that teachers just don't know how to do this, right? There was a survey that we put out in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Teachers Advisory Committee, that asked, have you had the training necessary to handle students that have experienced trauma in your classroom? And almost 3/4 of teachers said no. Yeah. So they did not know how to do this. And now I know all three of you are involved in teacher training and are passionate about that. But let's start with Arlinda. What advice would you give for schools or teachers that are looking for a good training program? What components of that program should they be looking for?
Well, first of all, I believe it's not just teachers. Our district actually trained the lunchroom workers, the bus drivers, custodians, everyone who deals with children in things to look for and how to de-escalate situations when a child may be having a come apart, to find out what's going on. Um, and then another thing I would suggest as far as new teachers and training teachers, the mentorship program, where you get a person who is trained in trauma informed classroom to help train a little bit, do a lot of modules, or do some things that where you can actually get involved with how to come up with conflict, I mean, with resolutions to the problems. Um, so I would say that there's so many different programs out there. I'm involved with two that are great that deal with the trauma informed classroom. But I would suggest that schools tackle it, but not just tackle it with the teachers, tackle it with everyone who is involved in the life of children, because teachers matter as well as the staff and everyone else, because children see them on a daily basis.
And then a component of that has to be sent home to inform the
Mm-hmm.
parents of
Yeah,
A, what you're doing, and B, how they can jump in and work with you and benefit the child.
definitely.
Making sure it's on a school level is important, getting your stakeholders involved, and really taking a hard look at your school climate. A lot of schools do climate surveys, and you can glean a lot of information about how students perceive their school, how parents perceive their schools, and say, okay, you know, what are we seeing here in terms of our lack of knowledge as it relates to, handling trauma, and really looking for programs that will help build your overall school climate. Because we want to make sure all students are accepted, and all families are accepted, and regardless of what they bring through the door. And we want to make sure that we can measure our success. And I think the other thing is to tell schools that this is not an overnight thing. It's going to take some time, and it may take up to 3 to 5 years to kind of get to where you need to be, and not to give up, because I think many times schools are trying something, and after a year it's like, we're really not moving. We got to keep working and keep that training going, because year one training is one thing. Year two, there's lessons learned. You're taking your learning to that next level, as well as your whole program to that next level. And you're learning and developing and implementing better and better each year. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. It's not an overnight thing as well.
So we're talking a lot of theory, and we're talking a lot about what a good program would feel like, kind of what it looks like. But give me specifics. If I walked into a school building that was trauma informed and doing it right, what would it feel like for me as an outsider? What would the experience be like for children that were in that building? And how would the staff interact?
The teacher would tell the students on the first day of school that I am here to protect you and I am here to keep you safe. And if you have any concerns about being safe, or when you need some help in any area, you can come to me and tell me. Anything is okay to say, because teachers assume kids know this, but they don't know this, and they have to be told. So that's what I would say to start the year off with.
And I would think when you walked into a school that was trauma informed, the look and feel of that school would shout it. The classrooms, do you have places that are calming and cozy and inviting that a child could go to if they needed a space, whether it's to lay down and rest or to have a place just to themselves for a minute? The tone of the school, how teachers speak to children and children speak to each other, would be set, as well as within that classroom and within that school. You would have safe rooms or safe places, because a lot of times when children are doing well in one classroom, there's another classroom that they may be able to go to where they have a connection with that teacher. So you would see a lot of unity within that school. And I would just say the whole thing would be inviting, where you have parents involved. You see parents involved in school throughout the day, doing something to help out. And I know with the pandemic, that's a little different, but I just believe when you're dealing with trauma, that you have to have things set in place specific for that trauma.
And that would include a chill center in the classroom, or a calming zone, which
Right.
is a place where children can go to de-escalate and regulate themselves with the help of the teacher, if, until they know how to do it on their own. And that would mean that she would teach them to give themselves self messages, whether streaming to stream to their mind while they're doing their deep breathing in there. And she would teach them to always to remain positive, and to how to express themselves appropriately when they're feeling frustrated. What's the appropriate way to deal with frustration? All these tools the teacher gives. There's a million strategies that you learn if you go to a Developing Trauma Informed Schools conferences. And all these strategies can be used in the classroom and then in that calming center, which is, teachers are very interested in that right now. Everyone who comes to my conferences asks about the calming center. So I put together a whole like little mini slideshow of different calming centers. And now with COVID, we have to not have things that they can each touch. So the idea would be that each one would have a little plastic box that opens with their own like little timer in there, or a squeeze ball, or maybe there's a headset in there for them to listen to calming music. There's all kinds of ways you can tailor it for each child in that zone. And if our watchers want to find out what they look like, they can just Google calming center in the classroom, and all kinds of really neat ideas will pop up.
We have a couple of questions, but before we get to them, I wanna ask something that I think is probably on the minds of a lot of teachers that are watching. It's definitely on my mind as I listen to this conversation. These are great ideas if I have my kids in school. What do I do about kids who are now remote? How do I make sure that I am focusing on trauma-informed practice with kids that aren't necessarily in front of me, that I may not see for a couple of months?
Even though you may not see them in your presence, when you're communicating with children each day, there's still signs you can look for within that remote learning, where you're seeing them on camera and you see a change. Even if they're having a problem during class where they need to take a moment to step away. One thing I love STEM projects, and I love Legos and stuff like that. And I found that it really helps children to calm down when they're focusing on creating. And so if you have a child who has those problems while you're at home, maybe you can get with the parent to see if they could maybe get a small Lego set, or maybe you can get one for them to keep at home, so that if they're having a problem like that, you say, take 5 minutes and go build me something, bring it back and show it to me, just to kind of redirect behaviors and also start establishing that relationship. And then if you continue to see those things, then you take note of that and try to have a discussion with someone to see what you can do to help that child.
Okay, so we also had a comment from Catherine in the chat who said that breakout rooms on Zoom can be great for facilitating these kinds of conversations and meeting with smaller groups than your whole class, which I think is a great idea.
Great idea.
So we have a question from Mauna from Tunisia. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. I'm taking my best shot at that. But her question revolves around bullying, that in her career, she had a girl that was experiencing some trauma in school because of negative comments about her body. She ended up developing a negative body image, and that led to some issues for her because of that trauma. How do we address bullying in a systemic way in our schools?
Sending the message that, regardless of what the issue is, that there are trusted adults that people can, or students can go to, whether you're being bullied, harassed, threatened, or you're threatening to harm yourself, or someone's threatening to harm someone else. There are trusted adults you can go to, and again, having that atmosphere that is safe and supportive, and those relationships that are being built is probably the first step to get that get that message out there on the systemic level. If all the adults know that they are viewed as trusted adults, then they know what to do when a student comes to them. And that takes some training, that takes some, you know, I guess training to get folks to understand that, because they may not be comfortable dealing with some of these situations that we talked about earlier. And it also involves the adults reaching out and building those relationships. Again, I think a lot of what we're talking about, it starts with relationships. And then, you know, I emphasize to students, if we don't know about it, we don't know about it. I've been in many, many situations where the student thinks, you know, I can handle this, or I don't want to be a burden on my mom or dad, you know, or they're too ashamed to talk about it. You know, emphasize to you know, to the students that, you know, if their friend is not comfortable going, you know, let them know that you care about them and that you're going to go get them help, and encourage those students to seek help from trusted adults. Because if we don't know about it, we can't respond to it. And that's very tricky, particularly in this day and age with cyberbullying. You know, that is insidious, and that's going on all the time. And, you know, we have to be able to respond to it and discover it.
So we also have a question from Melissa, and this one is specifically to Arlinda. Arlinda, you talked about tone, how we talk with our peers in school, but we also know that students are constantly interacting with each other in our schools. How does character education intersect with trauma-informed practice?
In our trauma-informed classroom, you're teaching your children first to be empathetic, and so with each other. So even when you're talking about character and and you're dealing with bullying and things like that, a lot of times when you're dealing with a person who's bullying, there's some type of self-esteem thing going on. It's something going that the person bullying does. So when you deal with character ed and you are dealing with how you speak to people, how you address people, about respect and how you respect each other, that's very important in a trauma classroom, because that's going to help out with how they communicate with each other. Children communicate with each other, and also how adults communicate, because character ed is not just for children, I believe. Sometimes, you know, if a teacher's really having a problem with a child, that it shows. And so showing children how to be kind, how to speak to each other, you're in turn showing them you know how to do it, and you practice those things as well. So I just believe character ed is a key component to helping children within the classroom and outside the classroom with dealing with society.
Yeah, and thank you to our viewers who are sending in those questions. For the rest of you, if you have more questions, keep sending them our way, and we'll address them as they come in. But I want to shift just a little bit for a second to the naysayers, to the hardcore academic, you know, those that have an academic focus that say, all of this sounds fantastic, safe spaces and timers and whatever, but we've got math and science and reading that we've got to get to. We don't have time for all of this, you know, fluffy stuff in schools. You know, what do you say to someone that is making that argument that we just don't have enough time in the day to make our schools trauma informed?
We don't have enough time in the day not to. It's an absolute necessity for people to learn about this. There's so many professional development sessions that are really kind of a bunch of hogwash. And we could replace them with something like this, where it would take them out. I teach at different conferences. I teach a 3-hour class, and in only 3 hours, and that means, you know, you could do it for 3 hours on 3 Wednesdays or whatever, you can equip teachers with the skills they need to work with these kids. And they feel so much better because now they have the strategies that they need. And I've never really heard anyone naysay against this, so that's kind of unusual for me. Maybe they go away, turn away from me, and roll their eyes. I've never heard it.
My favorite saying is, you have to reach them to teach them. So if you can't reach that child and you can't get their trust, and you can't get their attention and you can't get them to invest and buy into what you're teaching, then you're not going to be able to teach them. So reach them first, and then you can teach them.
And I would argue that, academics and mental health or mental wellness are really two sides of the same coin. And I would ask them, some of the naysayers to say, well, what is the goal of education? Partly the goal of education is to help students grow and graduate so they can be productive and make great contributions to their communities. And when we look at the definition of mental health in the World Health Organization, we talk about individuals, learning about their abilities, being able to cope with stressors in life so that they can also be fruitful and productive in their communities. So really, those two definitions are very, very similar. And I think the end goal is the same. We want our students to be successful. We want them to be productive, and we want them to make great contributions to their community. So I would also ask them to say, what are the big corporations looking for? They're looking for students or, a potential employee that has social skills, that can work with others, that can collaborate. So we are the perfect place to teach that. And that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, and I hope no one viewing really thinks that that's my question. I mean, obviously, I think the three of you know that I was just setting that up for you to knock it down. And I tend to agree with Jackie that I've never heard anyone come out specifically against trauma-informed practices, but what I have heard is people not prioritize it. Right? It's just lower on the list of things we have to get to. And, we just don't have time. We're not going to train our teachers on that because they're, they have to learn this new platform that we have or whatever it is. And I think that all three of you made the case that this has to be a top priority, that we can't do the other things unless we do this first. But we also know that right now, as budgets are being squeezed and schools are having to make tough decisions, that one of the things that's on the chopping blocks is physical education, the arts, humanities. And I know from reading research that those things are heavily involved in making and allowing our students to be mentally healthy and in some cases mitigating the effects of trauma. I know there's a fantastic Nigerian educator who is world renowned. I actually wrote about him in one of my books for art therapy, right? Helping kids from girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram overcome that trauma through art therapy. Do any of the three of you or all of you want to speak, whoever wants to, speak about the importance of arts and humanities and physical education and those, what we call specials in school, I hate that term, and trauma-informed practices?
For the better part of 30 years, I taught students with behavioral disorders and learning disabilities. So my heart is not only with trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive, but also with special ed kids. And I can tell you that I was a resource teacher. I just retired, and I would do interdisciplinary units. And part of what I had them do was to draw. And when they were reading a book, for instance, they would draw a picture of a chapter and write a little summary under it. And then that would, by the end of the book, after each chapter, they could actually retell the book. And that all had to do with their art and the fact that some kids with a learning disability might not be able to remember all those, all those incidents in a book. So it builds their self-esteem and their confidence. And they need that. And music is another one of the arts that I don't know how a classroom can really exist without different levels of music to keep that tone Arlinda was talking about.
I would like to address it as well, just be bringing my own personal experience in with that, being that music and art, all those are therapeutic, but not just therapeutic. Every child is born with a special arete, a special gift, and that's the way of expressing and speaking and showing their uniqueness. And my son, he's small, and he kind of dealt with a lot of things in school with bullying and that sort of thing, to the point where we were getting concerned about his mental well-being, and we would notice him acting out and doing things. And but he has a gift for music. And so I told him, I said, put your feelings into music, write a song. And he wrote a song about being bullied and how he he wanted to feel empowered. He didn't want to be afraid to go to school. And then later on, when all the racial tension was happening, he wrote a song about wanting to live, that he wanted to grow up to live and see being a man. And so I know for a fact that if a child has to draw to show you that something's going on, or to help get their feelings out, or write a song, or even with PE, the fact that they can take that energy and put it into something to get it out, I think all those things are very important for children to have as an outlet.
It's a terrible thing to talk about, but I think it intersects with what we're discussing. So I think it's important to bring up. But school shootings have been on the rise over the past decade and longer. I would say that is probably a reflection of some of the mental health and trauma issues that we have in our schools. How does making our schools more trauma informed, how does that make students safer, not just from school shootings, but also from some of the other societal ills that we see in our teenagers and younger students?
I think just establishing that safe and supportive environment. If we talked about a little bit earlier that when you walk into school, you can feel the vibe. Sometimes, when it's a good school, you can feel the lights are brighter, everyone's friendlier, that kind of thing. But when you walk into a school that doesn't have a great, doesn't have a supportive climate, doesn't have a safe climate, it's not going to be good for anyone's mental wellness or anyone's state of mind. So establishing a safe and supportive schools where there supports for a variety of kids, mental health supports, academic supports, behavioral supports, having the mental health staff, whether it be school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers available, and having trained teachers to understand what trauma is, and how to support them through trauma-informed practices. I think it sets that environment on a different trajectory than the unsupportive and unsafe school environment. That I think that's one aspect of it, and I think it's a very important one.
As we well know, by statistics and looking at the school shootings and that sort of thing that's uprising, a lot of those children are the ones who are committing some of these things as they got older, because they dealt with trauma year after year and they didn't get the help needed. And so what happened is it manifested into them feeling the ultimate way to express themselves was to go in and harm someone else, or to make the pain stop by shooting the people that they felt offended by. So by starting a trauma-informed classroom, we're getting behind the why before they get to the how they're going to express themselves. We give them the how. We show them how to tell us what's on their mind, how to get the help they need, how can we help them. So I think it's very important to help negate some of these things children are dealing with when they take it out on others, by giving them the outlet they need. So that's the most important part of the trauma-informed classroom, is the outlet for them.
And there are also all kinds of groups. I don't know if any of you heard of Bionic, but it's a group within the school system, and their whole purpose is to teach children through modeling and outreach programs to look out for each other and notice what each other's signs, and their behaviors have changed, and when they're eating lunch by themselves or walking home by themselves, to let the leaders of the group, or in this case, other case, it would be the social worker, the resource teacher, the homeroom teacher, would let somebody know that they're feeling this way. And with all these kids, like in little tentacles taking care of each other, that's part of that trauma-informed feeling too.
So I know I have a biased panel here in the question that I'm asking. So I kind of know what your answers are going to be, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because I think it's important, and I want to get you on the record. So let's say that you are advising a school that has a certain amount of money put aside, and they can use that money either to harden their school, hire more police officers, more metal detectors, make their school safer in that way, or they could use that money towards developing a trauma-informed culture and training their staff and bus drivers. And which one of those two recommendations would you make? Which one do you think is going to make the school safer?
You have to do it from the inside out. You can't just fix the external stuff. You've got to fix the internal stuff, the heart of the matter.
And that the metal detectors and more police presence, that is actual trauma. You're bringing more trauma in fact. So I would definitely be on the side of trying to find out a way to reach the children instead of give them more trauma.
Absolutely. Elena, you bring up an excellent point. I think that the misconception out there is, you have to have these metal detectors. You have to have this prison-like school. And in fact, it does the complete opposite of what we hope. Now, is physical safety important? Yes. I don't want to downplay that, but psychological, emotional safety is very, very important as well. And I would say spending the money on making sure you have the staff, first of all. A lot of schools, they're losing their mental health staff. And in fact, there's not enough mental health staff out there to support schools. There's a shortage of school psychologists, school counselors, social workers, even school nurses. So I would say, making sure you have the right staff and then taking a look at what are the specific needs of the school, and look at programs that can focus on mental wellness, focus on social emotional needs, focus on trauma-informed care and practices, and restorative practices, and see if we can bring as much of that in there, because I think to address these needs, we like you said, it's starting from the inside out, and it's an all-school responsibility to make sure that schools and students are safe.
And if I may add to what to the discussion about teachers also having some trauma, um, even with now dealing with COVID and death and that sort of thing, we must remember that children, they're exposed to trauma, and but teachers as well, they deal with trauma, even dealing with the trauma of a child. When you deal with a child who may have something going on in the house, it's just so heartbreaking. That teacher has to take that home and deal with it. And so when you talk about spending money, it should also be geared towards teachers who may need to make sure they have their mental well-being in check.
Yeah, this is just a phenomenal conversation, and there's so many questions that I want to ask, but we're down to only 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you to keep the answer to the next question brief, because I want to get to 2 more. So Ben brought up restorative practices, and I think that's a really important place to go here. I know all of you are passionate about making sure that when kids have behavioral issues in school, that we are dealing with them appropriately. How does restorative justice and restorative practices, how does that tie into trauma-informed schools and how we deal with those issues that we see in school?
That's a perfect example of what the teacher who didn't know what to do had never experienced. That's in itself, that's a whole in-service that teachers need to have, but they, especially if they have not worked with different populations, just, the same population, that's not going to get them the background they need.
So can you give me, for those that are listening that aren't sure, just a brief description of what restorative justice or restorative practices refers to?
Restorative practice is just a manner of understanding how to communicate between two groups to make sure whatever wrong was created or done was made right, and how to improve it. And there's many different approaches. And I think it's also excellent for building relationships. I think a couple times through our earlier conversation we talked about circles, and that's one of the key principles or techniques in restorative practice. Build that sense of community, and build that understanding amongst the community, so that when something does happen, they can come together and see if they can right the wrong that was done.
Okay, last question. We're out of time. So in 30 seconds, I want you to keep it brief. What is your 30-second piece of advice that you can give to teachers that are watching right now on what they should do first week of school, or if they're already in school, tomorrow when they get into school? What should teachers do right now?
I would say that the first thing you do is get to know your children, find out everything about them you can, so that when you do see changes, you'll immediately know. And if you do have questions, please find out the why behind what's going on.
Great. Jackie?
Well, I would say to start out by building relationships. That whole first couple of weeks should be all kinds of connections between the teacher and the student and the peers. And I would say to consider their children's interests, concerns, and perspectives to be important, legitimate, and worth listening to. And stay with them and focus on their strengths to ameliorate their areas of weakness. There's all kinds of ways that you can lift up children and build their self-esteem, which is half the battle.
Yeah, I agree. It all starts with relationship. And my recommendation would be start early and make sure that you focus on cultivating relationship from the beginning of the year through the end of the school year and beyond. And try to weave in opportunities for relationship building throughout the day, throughout the curriculum, with students as well as families and colleagues.
Fantastic. And before I wrap us up, I just want to share in the chat, Catherine has said that in school we need to focus on the 3 R's in education, relationships, relevance, and resilience, which I think is fantastic and wraps up exactly what the 3 of you were just saying. But we're out of time, so thank you to the National Coalition for Safe Schools, LifeChanger of the Year, and our 3 absolutely incredible panelists who provided so much inspiration and so much knowledge today. Ben, Jackie, and Arlinda, you are absolute rock stars, and we are blessed to have been able to have the past hour to learn from you. Thank you all of you who joined us and gave up part of your Wednesday to do a little bit of professional growth and professional learning with us. We appreciate your time, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.